Hello, and welcome to People of the Pod, brought to you by American Jewish Committee. Each week, we take you beyond the headlines to help you understand what they all mean for America, Israel, and the Jewish people. I'm your host, Manya Brachear Pashman. Adam Louis-Klein is a PhD candidate in anthropology at McGill University, where he researches anti-Semitism, Zionism, Jewish peoplehood, and broader questions of indigeneity and historical narrative. His work bridges academic scholarship and public commentary, drawing on field work with indigenous communities in the Amazon and studies in philosophy at Yale, the New School, and the University of Chicago. He writes on translation and the politics of peoplehood across traditions and is committed to developing a Jewish intellectual voice grounded in historical depth and moral clarity. He blogs for the Times of Israel, and he's with us today to talk about his experience emerging from the Amazon, where he was doing research after October 7th, 2023, and discovering what had happened in Israel. Adam, welcome to People of the Pod.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here on this podcast with the American Jewish community.
So tell us about the research that you are doing that took you into the depths of the Amazon rainforest.
So I work with a group called the Desano people who live in the Vaupés region, which is a tributary of the upper Rio Negro. Part of it's in Brazil, part of it's in Colombia today. I went there because I was really interested in trying to understand how people who are often seen at the margins of the world or the periphery of the global economy see themselves and their own sort of role in the cosmos and in the world in general. And what I found actually is that these people see themselves at the center of it all as a unique people, as a chosen people. And that was something that really inspired me and later led me to rethink my own relationship to Jewish peoplehood and chosenness and what it means to be a kind of indigenous people struggling for survival and recognition.
So were you raised Jewish? Did you have a Jewish upbringing?
Yeah, I was raised as kind of a cultural and Reform Jew. I wouldn't say that Israel was super present in our lives, but we did travel there for my younger brother's bar mitzvah at the Kotel. And that did have an impression on me. And then later on, I would wear a wristband of Brothers for Life, which is a charity for injured Israeli soldiers. But as time went on, I got involved in these radical academic scenes. And, my own field, anthropology, has fundamentally turned against Jewish peoplehood and Israel, unfortunately. But it was really in the Amazon, actually, that my journey of teshuvah and rediscovering my Jewishness and importance of Jewish peoplehood was really reawoken for me.
You were involved in these radical circles. Did you ascribe to some of the beliefs that a lot of your academic colleagues were ascribing to? Did you start to question the legitimacy of Israel or the actions of the Israeli government?
I think I started to ascribe to them in a kind of background and passive way, in the way that I think that many people in these communities do. So I had actually learned about Israel. I did know something. But as I wanted to kind of ascribe to a broader social justice narrative, I sort of immediately assumed when people told me that Israelis were the ones doing the oppression and the injustice, that had to be true. And I didn't question it so much. So it's ironic that those spaces, I think, that are built around critical thought have become spaces, in my opinion, that are not so critical today. And I think we really need a critical discourse around this kind of criticism, sort of to develop our own critical discourse of what anti-Zionism is today.
So what inspired the research? In other words, so you're involved in these radical circles, and then you go and immerse yourself with these tribes to do the research. What inspired you to do it? And was it your Jewishness?
So I think what led me to anthropology was probably a kind of diasporic Jewish sensibility. So I'd studied philosophy before, and I was very entrenched in the Western tradition, but I was kind of seeking to think across worlds and think in translation. I've always kind of moved between countries and cities. And I think that's always been an intuitive part of who I am as a Jew. And anthropology was founded by Jews, by Franz Boas or Emil Durkheim or Claude Lévi-Strauss. So I think that's kind of part of what brought me there. But I ended up rediscovering also the meaning of, a homeland as well, and what it means to be part of a people with a unique destiny and relationship to territory and land. And that made me understand Zionism in a completely new light.
And did you understand it when you were there? Did you come to these realizations when you were there, or did you start to piece all of that together and connect the dots after you emerged?
So part of my research looks at how Indigenous people engage with Christian missionaries who try and translate the Bible into Indigenous languages. So when that encounter happens, it's actually quite common throughout the world that a lot of Indigenous people identify with the Jewish people quite strongly. So this might sound a little counterintuitive, especially if someone's used to certain activist networks in which indigeneity is highly associated with Palestinians. Jews are treated now as settler colonists, which is basically the opposite of indigeneity. And that's become a kind of consensus in academia, even though it seems to fly in the face of both facts and our own self-understanding as Jews. But so I saw that in the Amazon in the way people at the margins of the world who might not already be integrated in the academic, activist kind of scene sort of organically identify with the Jewish people in Israel. And they admire the Jewish people in Israel because they see in us a people that's managed to maintain our cultural identity, our specific and distinct civilization, while also being able to use the tools of modernity and technology to benefit us and to benefit the world. So I think that also kind of disrupts some primitivist notions about Indigenous people that they should remain sort of technologically backwards, so to speak. I think that they have a more nuanced approach.
What did you discover when you did emerge from the Amazon? In other words, October 7th had happened. When did you emerge and how did you find out?
So I had been living in a remote Desano village without internet or phone or any connection to the outside world for months. And then I returned a couple days after October 7th to a local town. So I was still in the Amazon, but I was signing onto my computer for the first time in months. And I remember signing onto Facebook and I saw the images of people running from the Nova Festival. And that was the first thing that I saw in months from the world. So that was a very traumatic experience that sort of ruptured my sense of reality in many ways. But the most difficult thing was seeing my intellectual milieu immediately transform into a space of denial or justification or even just straightforward aggression and hate to anyone who showed any solidarity with Israelis in that moment or who saw it as a moment to say something positive and inspiring and helpful about the Jewish people. That was actually seen as an act of violence. So I went to Facebook and I don't remember exactly what I said, but I said, I stand with the Jewish people or with Israelis or Am Yisrael Chai or something like that. And many people in my circles really interpreted that as an aggression. So at that point, it was really strange because I'd been living in the Amazon trying to help a people with their own cultural survival, their own struggle to reproduce their own civilization in the face of assimilation and a surrounding society that refuses to validate their unique identity. And then I came back to the world and I was seeing the exact same thing happening to my own people. And even stranger than that, it was happening to my own people, but in the language of critique and solidarity. So the very language I'd learned in anthropology of how to support Indigenous people and sort of to align myself with their struggles was now being weaponized against me in this kind of horrible inversion of reality.
Had you sensed this aggressive tone prior to your time in the Amazon and when you were involved in these circles?
No, I'd never witnessed anything like this in my life. And so it took some real searching and going inward. And I was still in the jungle, but encountering all this anti-Zionist hate online from people I thought were my friends. I had to really ask myself, maybe I'm in the wrong because I've never seen people act like the people who are scholars, intellectuals, who should be thinking critically about anti-Semitism, because anti-Semitism, we talk a lot about in the academy critical race theory. So we look at ideologies, tropes, and symbols that are used to dehumanize minority groups. And we learn to be skeptical. So we learn that there are discourses that speak at times in languages of reason, of justice even, that are actually biased, structurally biased against minorities. So then I was deeply confused. Why did these same people not know how to apply those same analytics to Jews? And not only did they not know how, they seemed to think it was offensive to even try. So that was really strange. And I had to kind of think, well, maybe I'm wrong. I think there's a process of, they've attempted to sort of stabilize this consensus at such a degree that Israel is committing genocide, that Israel is a settler colonial entity that is fundamentally evil, basically, and Israelis are fundamentally oppressors. They've created a space it's almost impossible to question them. And it took me a long time to come to that realization that I think anti-Zionism is really a discourse of libel, fundamentally. And these accusations, I wouldn't say are offered in good faith. And it's unfortunately not much use to try and refute them. So instead, I started writing, and I started trying to analyze anti-Zionism itself as an object of critique and as an ideology that we can deconstruct.
So did this change the course of your academic research? You've started writing. Are you writing academic articles, or is it more the Times of Israel blog and more public writings?
So I've been writing publicly. I started writing on Facebook, and then the readership on Facebook started to grow, and then I expanded to the Times of Israel. And I do have some plans lined up to try and get this material out in the academic context as well, because I think that's really important, that we build parallel academic spaces and our own language of academic legitimacy, because I think that academic language, and as well that kind of activist language, critique of oppression, is valuable, but it's also culturally hegemonic today. And so I think that as Jews, if we abandon that language, we will have trouble telling our story. So I think there are also projects like this. I'd like to mention the London Center for the Study of Contemporary Anti-Semitism. I think that's a great model. So they're doing serious academic work on contemporary anti-Semitism, not just classical anti-Semitism, which we're all familiar with, neo-Nazis, etc. What does it look like today? Red triangles, Hamas headbands. This is a new language of hate that I think we need to be on top of.
In fact, you presented a paper recently there, correct? At the London Center, at a conference sponsored by the London Center?
Yeah, I did. I presented a paper. It was called Dissolving the Denotational Account of Anti-Semitism. So denotational means what words refer to, because what I found very often is that it's a trope that's become really familiar now. Anti-Zionists, they say, we don't hate Jews, we only hate Zionists. We don't hate Judaism, we hate Zionism. We're not anti-Semitic, we're critical of Israel. So these distinctions that are made are all about saying, you can't point to us as attacking Jews because our language is such that we are denoting, we are referring to something else. So in my talk, I was trying to explain that I like to look at anti-Zionism more like a symbolic anthropologist. So when an anthropologist goes and works with an indigenous culture, we look at the kinds of symbols that they use to articulate their vision of the world. The jaguar, for example, becomes a symbol of certain kinds of potency or predation, or, for example. So I look at anti-Zionism in the same way. It's not important to me whether they think they're referring to Israel or Jews. What's important to me is the use of conspiratorial symbols, or a symbol of child killing, for example. So we see that classical anti-Semitism accused Jews of killing children. Anti-Zionism today constructs Israelis as bloodthirsty and desiring to kill children. So when we see that even if they say not Jews, Zionists, they're using similar symbols that have mutated. So I think that's what I'm trying to track, is both the mutation of classical anti-Semitism into anti-Zionism and also the continuities between the two.
Did you ever experience anti-Semitism from your academic circles, or really anywhere in life from childhood on?
Not particularly. So I went to a Northeastern prep school and there were very few Jews. So I think we were sort of seen as another to the kind of traditional Northeast New England aristocracy. But it wasn't something that overt, I would say. I think that anti Semitism is something that occurs more so in cycles. So if you look at the 19th century emancipation of Jews and integration of Jews into society, that was the up part of the cycle, and then the reaction to that came on the down part of the cycle. So unfortunately, I think we're in the same thing today. So Jews have very successfully assimilated into American society and became very successful and integrated into American society. But now we're seeing the backlash, and the backlash is taking a new form, which is anti-Zionism, which allows itself to evade what classical anti-Semitism looks like and what we're used to identifying as classical anti-Semitism.
So I do want to talk about the word indigenous or indigeneity. Jews celebrate the creation of Israel as a return to their indigenous homeland, and Palestinians also consider it their indigenous homeland. So how are their definitions of indigeneity, how are those definitions different or distinct? I mean, how are their experiences distinct from each other's and from the people and the tribes with whom you immersed yourself in the Amazon?
So I think indigeneity, in its fundamental meaning, captures something very real that's common to tons of different groups across the world, which is a certain conception of the way that one's genealogical ancestry is connected to a specific territory where one emerged as a people and through which one's own peoplehood is defined. So as Jews, our own peoplehood is connected to the land of Israel. It's the promised land. It's the place where our civilization first flourished, and it's the place we've always looked to return to. And so that is very similar to indigenous groups around the world. Now, at the same time, I think there's another concept of indigeneity that gets thrown in and sometimes confuses the issue a little bit. Being indigenous relates to a specific history of dispossession, usually by European colonialism, starting in the 16th century. Now, in fact, there have been many colonialisms throughout history. So there have been Islamic civilization practiced widespread colonialism. The Romans practiced colonialism, the Babylonians. But there's a tendency to only look at this form of colonialism. And now, when we look at the Middle East, what we find then is these analytics are becoming confused and applied in strange ways. So we see that Palestinians, for example, their genealogical traditions is they understand themselves as tribally derived from tribes in Arabia that expanded with Muhammad's conquest, and that's very common. An Arabian culture and Arabic language is what they practice. And so at that level, from a factual perspective, Palestinians are not indigenous in the genealogical sense. However, there's a tendency to believe since Jews have a state today, then since they appear not as dispossessed, because Jews have actually repossessed our ancestral land, that Jews can't be indigenous. But so I think that's a confusion. The basic understanding of what indigenous means, and largely what the UN definition is based on, is this notion of continuous identification with the territory. So I really think that this isn't so much a question of who can live where. I think Palestinians' right to live in the land has largely been recognized by the UN partition plan in 1947 or the Oslo Accords and other peace deals. But it's a question of conceptual clarity and fact. And so at this level, I believe that the UN and other institutions should formally recognize Jews as indigenous to the land of Israel.
You have written, and I want to read this line because it's so rich. You have written that the recursive logic of an anti-Semitic consensus builds upon itself, feeds on moral certainty, and shields its participants from having to ask whether what they are reproducing is not justice at all, but a new iteration of a very old lie. Are there other examples of that phenomenon in academia, either currently or in the past?
So, what I was trying to grasp with that was my sense of despair in seeing that it was impossible to even point people to fact within academia or debate these issues or explain to non-Jews who Jews even are. So I got the sense that people are talking quite a lot about Jews, but don't seem to really care about our voices. So some of that writing that you're quoting is an attempt to understand anti-Zionism not only as libel, but also as a kind of practice of exclusion, where Jews feel silenced in spaces, and where, for all the talk of academic freedom versus anti-Semitism, which I think can sometimes be a tricky issue, I believe that Jews' own academic freedom has fundamentally been violated by this discourse. So that recursive logic is the way rumor and repeating slogans and repeating notions, regardless of their factual content, like that Jews are settler colonists, sort of builds on itself, as well as on social media with this algorithmic escalation until it's almost impossible to talk back to it. So an example would be in 2024, the American Anthropological Association had its big conference, and the Gaza genocide was the main theme. But it wasn't a theme we were all going to go and debate. It was a theme that we assumed was true, and we were going to talk about it as a thing in the world. And then the Society for Cultural Anthropology released an issue with the exact same premise. It was glorifying Ismail Haniyeh of Hamas and Nasrallah of Hezbollah. And then, interestingly enough, just the other day, they released another edition, which was about settler colonialism, and saying, we want to come back to this issue and reaffirm that settler colonialism applies to Israel and Palestine against people who are attacking the concept. And we're against the exceptionalization of Israel in their terms. And so I searched through the document, but I couldn't find anywhere where Jews were talked about as indigenous, not just as a fact, but even as a claim. I couldn't find anywhere in this journal where it was even acknowledged that Jews might believe that we are indigenous. So it's almost as if the very notion is just completely erased by consciousness within academia, which is quite frightening.
And do you feel able to push back on that? In other words, as a fellow anthropologist, are you able to ask, why is this omitted from this paper, from this journal?
No, because they will simply ignore you. So that's why I believe these parallel spaces are so important. And what I see my work trying to do is to help build a Jewish intellectual discourse. And unfortunately, I think we have to start a little bit internally. So we've been somewhat ghettoized. But if we build up that space and construct these spaces where we can share the same premises, and we don't have to argue from the bottom up every time, I think that will give us strength and also more clarity on our own understanding of what's happening. Both at the level of what is anti-Zionism, what is this new discourse, and at the level of how can we speak from Jewish peoplehood as a legitimate place to even theorize from or build academic theories from.
You mentioned earlier that you held on to doubt. You kept open the possibility that Israel is in the wrong here. And you were looking for signs or evidence that your colleagues were correct. But as you've watched the horrors unfold and wondered to yourself, whether maybe Israel isn't really defending itself, why have you not concluded that that is indeed the case? Why have you reached the opposite conclusion?
Yeah, so I talked earlier about using like a critical race theory analysis. So thinking about ideologies and the kind of tropes they're using and the way they're talking about Israelis. But I think that's only one part of the picture. So what I noticed is, one, they didn't want to do that kind of analysis. But two, they also weren't interested in empirical fact. So when I would sometimes try and do that analysis, like this sounds like anti-Semitic, right? They would say, oh, but it's true. Israel is doing this stuff. Israel is intentionally killing Palestinian children. Israel is going completely beyond the laws of war. This is a genocide of unique proportions, completely irrational and exaggerated statements. They also didn't want to engage with fact. I spent a lot of time digging up the sources of this material, given disinformation. For example, the Al-Ali incident, where it was claimed by the Hamas health ministry that Israel had intentionally bombed the Al-Ali hospital, killing 500 people. Al Jazeera promoted it. Western outlets also promoted it. And I had people all over my wall attacking me, saying that I'm justifying this by standing with Israel. And I saw what happened after, which was that they looked into it. The casualty count was tragic, but it was far lower than reported. It was about 50 people, and it was an Islamic Jihad rocket. So Israel was not even responsible. So I think that any rational person who sees what happened in that incident becomes skeptical of everything else they're being told and of the information circuits. And so when I also saw that the people who were talking about the Gaza genocide seemed completely unfazed by that, that made me have to rethink also what they were doing. Because if they're unfazed by something like that, that suggests this isn't a truth that they're being forced to acknowledge. It sounds a bit more like a truth that has its own sort of incentive to believe in despite fact, rather than being pushed towards it because of fact.
So I'm curious if you went back to the people that you had been immersed with and had been studying for the matter of months before October 7th. Did you go back to them and tell them what had happened, or did they somehow know what had happened? And I'm just curious if there was any kind of response from them.
Interesting. Yeah, I speak with them regularly on a regular basis. They don't know exactly what's happened. I think they see sometimes news, but it's largely their understanding is that there's a lot of wars in the Western world. They ask, why is there so much war? Why is there so much suffering? I mean, they were particularly interested in the Ukraine war because they couldn't wrap their head around why Putin was doing this, which I think is pretty similar to a lot of people. But they do see, some of them see Israel as kind of a figure of strength, and compare Israel almost to their own notions of ancestral sort of potency or power. So they have a very different understanding of the relationship between, let's say, power and victimhood. They don't necessarily fetishize being powerless.
Tell me a little bit about this tribe, these people that you spent time with.
So the Desano, they're one of a number of many ethnicities who inhabit the Northwest Amazonian region in Northwest Brazil and Southeast Colombia. They live in an extremely complex world in which there are, over 25 languages in the region, and they have a very unique form of marriage where you have to marry someone who speaks a different language than you. So any community has a kind of nucleus of people who speak the same language and are from the same tribe, but the women in the community all speak different languages and come from different tribes. So I think it's a kind of space where you have to think across difference. You're constantly confronted with people who are other than you, who are from different tribes and different communities, as well as the relationship between the Western world and the Indigenous world itself. And I think that's really part of the promise of anthropology. Like coming back to what I was saying earlier about a diasporic Jewish sensibility, I think it's also just a Jewish sensibility. Part of being a distinct people is that we need to think with other people, and I think that includes Muslims and Arabs and Christians as well.
That is such a enlightened approach to marriage. I mean, isn't that what marriage is all about, right? Is crossing those differences and figuring out, and they just do it from the very beginning. I'm also curious, though, are they also mixing with Western cultures? In other words, have they broadened that, or is it really, do they keep it within those villages?
Yeah, so they've taken on a lot of features of the surrounding Colombian Spanish language culture. And that is the struggle today because there's a lot of economic pressures to move to the towns and the cities in order to get work and employment. And that can pose problems to the reproduction of the traditional village community. And so that's part of what we've been struggling with, and part of the project with them. So we're currently translating an old book about anthropology about them into their language. So they have the Bible, which was translated into their language by missionaries, and now we also want to translate their own cultural material into their language. So that can help them preserve the language and preserve their own cultural knowledge.
So what's next for you, Adam?
So I'm hoping to continue writing and to continue getting out this work. I'm hoping to also work with grassroots organizers to try put some activist meat onto this opposition to anti-Zionism. So I believe that, as I was talking about, parallel academic spaces are really important. I also think it's important to be able to speak back to anti-Zionism with activist language, not only the academic side, but the activist side. So I think I'm working with a group now, a decentralized group, developing infographics, memes, things that can circulate to educate people about anti-Zionism as the new form of anti-Semitism today.
Thank you for taking on this work and for sharing your story.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure.
Thank you for listening. This episode is brought to you by AJC. Our producer is Atara Lakritz. Our sound engineer is TK Broderick. You can subscribe to People of the Pod on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or Google Podcasts, or learn more at ajc.org/peopleofthepod. The views and opinions of our guests don't necessarily reflect the positions of AJC. We'd love to hear your views and opinions or your questions. You can reach us at peopleofthepod@ajc.org. If you've enjoyed this episode, please be sure to tell your friends, tag us on social media with #PeopleOfThePod, and hop on to Apple Podcasts to rate us and write a review to help more listeners find us. Tune in next week for another episode of People of the Pod.